Okay, so, welcome everybody to the second meeting of the working groups in the mathematical laws of morphology and biomechanics. So today, Kathleen, we are going to have two small presentations. Kathleen is going to keep going with her discussions on chapter 2 of the textbook. And after that, myself, so I will go through some introductory material on differential equations for biomechanics, and in the next weeks I will move to some examples in chapter 5. So please, Kathleen, the stage is yours.
Okay, great. Share my second screen. And there we go. All right, so today we're going to be talking about chapter 2, as Alessandro said, of animal locomotion, physical principles and adaptations by Gordon and Blicken and De Vere and Vidler. And the main goal of this chapter is to provide background on the origins, history, and variety of animals in order to provide the morphological and biomechanical context that we need as we move forward through the working group. And this is more of a background for the mathematicians and physicists that might be in the audience. A lot of biologists will be sort of comfortable with the level that I'm going to be discussing these sort of concepts, but it's nice to have some nice foundation for us to work from as we move forward. So the goal, this sort of second major goal is going to be to achieve basic familiarity with some of the key tools and concepts of evolutionary biology, such as the diversity of animal morphologies and biomechanical strategies, so that we can get sort of a evolutionary context for what we're going to be discussing as we move forward. Okay, so people have this tendency to categorize things. Humans have this very natural predisposition towards this, and this is argued to come from a neurological basis. There's an evolutionary advantage to being able to assess the importance of the signals that we're receiving from the environment, specifically identifying things that could potentially be dangerous to us versus things that would be to our benefit, such as potential prey or things that we're climbing around on. So there's a predisposition towards categorizing our environment into potentially hostile and potentially benign objects. And that tendency for categorization goes hand in hand with our inclination to name things. As we categorize things, we try to name them in order to be able to communicate. And that, dates right back to the beginning of language, where we wanted to communicate what particular objects were to those around us. Unfortunately, or maybe not unfortunately, there are a lot of languages in the world, and that of course creates a problem when it comes to accurate scientific communication about common objects. It's important that when we say the name for something, that we all universally, no matter what language you speak, can understand what we're talking about. And so that need for some kind of standardization in naming is what came from Carl Linnaeus. He developed this primarily Greek and Latin-based two-part naming system called binomial nomenclature in the 18th century. And this two-part name for a species is genus plus species. So the two names were considered important and required because that larger group, the genus, represents some similarities among all the species that belong to that genus. So there's a reason for the ways that the species are grouped into those genera. And I'm being deliberately vague here, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So in this way, with this genus and species idea, we can replace the common name with that scientific name in order to create a unique identifier for each species. For example, one of the species that I work with a lot is Anolis carolinensis. That is the scientific name. And then the common name in English is the green anole. Now, there are, just like we saw with the genus and the species, there are larger levels of categorization that are organized into this sort of hierarchical system in order to represent how similarities are shared among the various taxonomic units or taxa. So we can start off with species and work our way down in this diagram. So we have the species. That consists of multiple individuals that are reproductively isolated from individuals of other species. An example is the carolinensis part of Anolis carolinensis. And then we have the genus that all these multiple species belong to and are closely related to, and that's the Anolis bit of Anolis carolinensis. Then we have a family, which consists of multiple genera that share some common characteristics. We have the order, which consists of multiple families. We have a class, which consists of multiple orders. We have a phylum, which consists of multiple classes. And we have a kingdom that consists of multiple phyla. And we have a domain, which consists of multiple kingdoms. And there are 4 domains commonly recognized right now. So another example is over in the image on the right-hand side of the screen where we have the panther classified through these. And of course there are, we've divided it into 7 categories that we're trying to divide all of life into. And so very naturally we find it meaningful sometimes to subdivide these categories into like superorder or suborder or superclass or subclass in order to provide some other opportunities to identify some shared common characteristics among some of the subgroups. And this is sort of the issue that commonly arises anytime you try to categorize things that are inherently more of a continuum. So I have been deliberately vague with how I've been talking about these shared common characteristics, or the basis upon which we are classifying these organisms. And that's because when Linnaeus came up with this, it predated the concepts of evolution and natural selection. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace's contributions to evolutionary understanding and coming up with the theory of natural selection was accepted or was published and accepted. And so up until that point, animals were being grouped based on some kind of characteristics. Once evolution came into the scheme of things, and certainly after genetics came into it with Gregor Mendel's contributions and pioneering the field of genetics, once those bits of information came in, it became clear that we wanted the way that we categorize things to reflect the relationships among the species, how certain species might have evolved from other species, and their genetic similarities versus differences. And so taxonomy changed into this sort of other discipline, phylogenetic systematics. So I want to do a little tiny diversion here for thoroughness, discussing sort of some common definitions of evolution and natural selection. So evolution can be defined as changes in the genetic composition of populations through time. And when Darwin and Wallace started writing about this idea, they were primarily focusing on the idea of natural selection, which sort of works in this way as I've listed out in these bullets. So the idea is that individuals within a genetically variable population, that genetic variation can come up through mutations, through migrations where animals are moving between places, or through random events that we can all pile together under the umbrella of genetic drift. So individuals that belong to these genetically variable populations are going to have differential survival and reproductive success. Some individuals will survive and some won't. The genes of the ones that have greater fitness, in other words, survive long enough to reproduce more and contribute more to the next generation, are going to tend to increase in frequency. In other words, they're selected for. The genes of the survivors and those who produce a lot of offspring will be passing their genes on in greater frequencies in the next generation. And over time, the change in gene frequency of the population will change, and that is evolution. And so features that are improving an ability of an animal to survive and reproduce are considered adaptive. And anything else is just coming along for the ride. It's definitely not the case that every single characteristic of an animal is contributing in a positive way to their ability to survive and reproduce. And there are many examples of that, and we can talk about that later. So the other main thing that I want to mention is the idea of the biological species concept. So as these genetic differences between two populations accumulate, as we have these changes in gene frequencies over time, and we have two populations that are, for some reason, not able to exchange genetic material, not able to mate with each other, so there's no what we call gene flow, which would be the case of spatial separation. In this little cartoon, a road is built and it separates two populations of frogs, for example. In those situations, when the genetic differences accumulate so much, there may be a situation where even if the populations come back into contact, mating events will fail to produce viable offspring, meaning either the offspring won't survive even to birth, or if they do survive to birth, they may not survive to maturity, or they may be infertile and so not able to pass on their genes to the next generation. So there's sort of an evolutionary blind spot, a dead end, so to speak. And at that point, we consider the populations to have diverged into two different species. And so that's the idea of the biological species concept. And note that it can only apply to living species. We can't test the reproductive compatibility of extinct species. Even when populations are genetically separated on different continents, experimentally, scientists could always come back together and put individuals together, let them mate, and see what happens and see if it's viable. And so we can test this idea of a species according to this biological species concept. But that, of course, can't happen among extinct species. So there are other species concepts, and the question of what is a species is still a very hotly debated question. Okay, so let's assume we are able to identify species. How should we classify those species? How should we organize them into these varying groups in this hierarchy? What data should we use? In general, we are going to be relying on observable characteristics, and these characteristics could come from a number of sources. And of course, the question is which of these sources is the most relevant, the most likely to produce the correct answer. So some of these sources of information could be morphology, external and internal morphology, and this is certainly what was used initially when trying to classify organisms. Shortly after that, you could argue that developmental characteristics came into play, and the idea that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny was introduced. And this is a really interesting idea that is certainly true in broad strokes, where the idea is that there are certain developmental similarities, and at early stages in development, we sort of resemble some of the more basal vertebrate groups, for example. We can draw on fossil record data, microscopic morphology, made available to us through new technologies that allow us to see cellular and subcellular components. And then molecular data. We can use DNA and RNA, both from nuclear and mitochondrial sources, proteins, enzymes, metabolic pathways, epigenetics. Lots of different sources of data can be used in order to classify these species. So that means that you can be producing all sorts of various classification schemes, and the question is which answer is correct. Each of these different data sources could be used by themselves. They could be used in combination in order to create a hypothesis about the true relationships among species. And that is visualized in the form of a phylogenetic tree. Thanks to computational power and information theory, there's a burgeoning field. Well, I mean, arguably it has been around for a while now, but it is possible to quantitatively compare the phylogenetic trees. And when we do that, when we see that there is a greater agreement among trees from different sources, then we see that it is, we sort of interpret that as indicating that we're closer to the truth, that it's closer to representing the true nature of the relationships among the species. But there are often many differences. For example, branch lengths could be different in the phylogenetic trees, or the organization of where the species fall out in the classification scheme can be different. And so there are lots of debates about which of the underlying characteristics are used to produce, that are used to produce those trees are the most relevant for creating the true tree. And it should also be noted that in addition to choosing the data that you use, the assumptions, the mathematical and statistical assumptions that we're operating under can also affect the topology of the phylogenetic tree. Things like maximum parsimony, where the simplest, the Occam's razor principle, where the simplest situation is probably the truth, the situation that involves the fewest independent origins of a particular trait, for example, or maximum likelihood. So those are two of the common sort of assumptions, but there are some others. And then once we've got a phylogenetic tree, we can try to calibrate it through time. And the idea of time calibration comes from the fact that there's a considerable amount of genetic variation that comes from single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. Those are individual point mutations, which means that a single nucleotide in a DNA sequence is swapped out for a different one. And this happens in a lot of places throughout the genome, and in some places it happens in active genes that are critical to survival, and those mutations could be damaging and cause death of the organism. But there are many bits of the genetic sequence that are arguably not being used, and so they can they're sort of just fitting into the background and just a clock sort of ticking away. Gradually, we have steadily through time this accumulation of changes in these individual nucleotides, and that's ticking away like this molecular clock, and allows us to estimate the time since divergence between two species. And then that, of course, estimate can be compared with the fossil record in order to calibrate, in order to sort of as a check. Yeah. So cladistics came about as from a need to sort of try to compare quantitatively these different phylogenetic trees. So the second we bring in, the computers, and we try to, compare all of these different trees that are produced with all these different data, that sort of falls within the field of cladistics. And the idea behind cladistics is that all lineages began monophyletically, in other words, as a single clade, a single group, that originally was founded by a single small population of an ancestral species. And over time, the descendants of this ancestral species multiply, diversify, spread out over the environment, and accumulate changes in their genetic code, accumulate changes in their morphologies and in their functions, to the point where they become so different that they become reproductively isolated, if we're using the biological species concept. And so this is how we get the splitting off of multiple species. So that's the idea that we're working with cladistics. And based on a phylogenetic tree or a cladogram, you can determine whether or not certain characters are retained from an ancestor, which are called plesiomorphic characteristics, or whether they're derived from an ancestral characters. And so that first diagram in the top left sort of indicates where the gray plesiomorphic ancestral condition is retained in the first two groups on the right and becomes something else in the two groups on the left. And that's the apomorphic characteristic there. And then we can also understand some of these differences in terms of whether or not structures are homologous, whether they're modified from each other, but share a common developmental origin. And an example are the forelimbs of vertebrates, which I'm showing you in the top right, or whether or not morphological similarities that have come up are not because the animals are similar, but because they have independently evolved similar solutions to the problems that they're facing. And really good examples are the convergent evolution in placental mammals and Australian marsupials, where we have wolf niches and cats and gliders and climbers and mice equivalents, and working our way through where we have independent evolution of these similar morphologies and functions in these species. Okay, so using all of these different ways of categorizing things, we can divide life into 4 domains. 3 of these domains belong to sort of a category that's called prokarya or prokaryotes. 1 is eubacteria, also known as true bacteria. 2 are archaea, or the sort of extreme bacteria. And then the 4th domain is the eukarya, which are what animals belong to. And they're defined by having their DNA enclosed within a nucleus. Proteins are primarily produced in an organelle inside the cell called the endoplasmic reticulum. Energy is primarily produced in mitochondria. And even if we don't, there are a couple of hypotheses about the relative relationships between these 4 domains. Animals, which will be the consideration for us for this book and for this year, they're all consistently grouped as a monophyletic group within eukarya. So if we just consider kingdom Animalia, there are 32 phyla that can be subdivided based on 3 characteristics. First, the number of tissue layers that they have. Either they have no true layers, and 2 phyla belong to that. They have 2 layers, meaning they're diploblastic, or they're 3 layers, meaning they're triploblastic. And the vast majority of animals are triploblastic. They have 3 tissue layers called endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. The second characteristic we can group animals based upon, and specifically the triploblasts based upon, are whether or not they have the presence of a particular body cavity that's called a coelom. 3 phyla, we don't know exactly how to classify them, interestingly enough. 8 phyla do not have this body cavity. 5 do have a similar body cavity, but it arises from different processes, and so they're called pseudo-coelomate. And 11 phyla are coelomate, meaning they have this true category, this true body cavity. And then among the coelomates, we can classify animals based on their embryonic origin of their mouth. Either they are protostomes, and 6 phyla belong to that. They're deuterostomes, and 3 phyla, including chordates, which include the vertebrates, belong to that group. And then 2 are sort of unknown how they should be classified within. So those are sort of like the broad sort of picture of the large scale classifications within the animals. So in order for animals to diversify and speciate and generate these new species, they're doing this as a consequence of them moving around, encountering new environments, surviving at different rates, differentiating genetically based on their differential survival and reproduction. How well they're able to survive in a given environment is determined based on their characteristics that are intrinsic to the animal, such as their genetic makeup and the phenotypic consequences of that genetic makeup, and a bunch of external characteristics. In other words, what's going on in the environment around them? What's that environmental filter that's impacting how well their internal or intrinsic characteristics are suited to the environment? So that could be changes in or properties of the non-living or abiotic environment and the biotic environment. And then natural selection acts on the genetic variation that comes up through mutations that we talked about earlier in order to gradually change the range of conditions that animals are able to tolerate. And resistance adaptations are adaptations that help with this, or that alter an animal's ability to tolerate different conditions, or that change animal performance. Something like how fast or how far or how well animals can accomplish certain tasks. And those are called capacity adaptations, those adaptations that improve animal performance in a given environment. And so where an animal lives plays a really important role. And so this idea of ecological niche naturally comes out of this. The ecological niche of an animal can be defined mathematically as an n-dimensional space in which an animal is capable of living. And these dimensions are the properties of the animal that define their tolerance for different conditions or their performance capacity. So that's where the resistance and capacity adaptations come in. And there are 2 potential adaptations that naturally fall out of this. The first is the potential or the fundamental niche. And this is where the whole area that an animal would be capable of living in based on its properties. And then we have the realized niche, which is where the animal actually lives. And that's determined based on the animal's interactions with other species in its environment or other environmental factors that are in place at that moment. And so this diagram here on the right is showing the distribution of 2 species of barnacles, for example, that shows that the species colored in brown has a fundamental niche that allows it to occupy the entire intertidal zone from below water level up to the very top of high tide. And then there's this blue species that can occupy almost the full range, but not quite the true high tide area, not the highest area. But the interaction and the competition between these species means that those species are occupying subsets of that environment. So that the brown species is occupying the highest regions, where the perhaps more competitive blue species is unable to survive. So it translates to a different realized niche for that brown species. All right. So all of these things change through time. Environments are changing through time and through space. Geographically, environments change. Animals are moving to different locations. They interact differently with their abiotic and biotic environments, and they mutate genetically, and so they're constantly evolving. And so both the potential or fundamental and realized niches that they occupy change through time and space. And the changes in those niches of all of those different species come together to make ecosystems that are changing through time and space. And so we can use things like the fossil record in order to try to reconstruct how the species, their niches, and the environment all have changed through time, through these major, geological events, or in between these major geological events like mass extinctions and asteroid collisions and things like that. And so paleontologists use the fossil record to try to understand the structure of communities and the biological processes that are going on in the organisms in the past. And not only can they do this or understand the morphological properties of the organisms themselves, but they can also look at things like trackways, things that are left behind by animals, like trackways and burrows that get preserved and can tell us something about the behavior of the animals. And that's particularly interesting, especially for biomechanists, because these trackways can be paired with biomechanical experiments and physical studies of sedimentary properties in order to understand what animals might have been doing in order to produce the changes in the trackway patterns that we see preserved in the fossil record. So that's kind of cool. And then finally, I just want to raise these sort of problems or criticisms of the fossil record. There are sort of four main ones that people point to as issues that come into play when we're trying to reconstruct these stories from the past. And the first is that older rocks and fossils are harder to find than younger rocks and fossils. They're deeper in the ground because rocks get layered up on top. And they're also more likely to have been damaged or destroyed because they've been around longer. And so this naturally would tend to impact the what we're able to see from the older species. It would skew our perception of the environment, the animals that existed back then, because in the older time periods, we wouldn't be able to necessarily extract as many representative species as probably were there. So there's a great deal of uncertainty in the degree to which the sampling of older rocks are representative of what actually existed at that time period. Second, environmental conditions conducive to fossilization are very rare. Only a very small set of animals happen to die in the particular locations, the particular times, and particular conditions that enable their bodies or anything else that they produce, like trackways, to be preserved. So again, how representative are these species that are only preserved in these very, very particular conditions? How much are we not seeing in the fossil record? And then common animals are more likely to be preserved than rare animals. We might not see any examples of some of the species that are not as plentiful. And then finally, there are, in terms of like modern practicalities, there are insufficient resources to sample all potential fossil deposits that exist on the planet. So sampling of these sites is skewed in favor of more accessible locations, or locations where funds are readily attainable. So there's a sampling bias here as well. And so all of these concerns have statistical implications that have to be considered. So that's pretty much it for chapter 2, covering sort of the highlights of what's going on in this book. Moving forward, we're going to be sort of switching gears and going into the more terrestrial biomechanics side of things. And moving forward with our discussions towards the morphology and the biomechanics in that terrestrial system. So just a reminder before I pass the floor over to Alessandro and his introduction to differential equations. This is the website for the working group and the seminar series that goes along with it. And yeah, thanks for joining. I will stop sharing and pass the floor over to Alessandro.
So, any questions or comments for Kathleen? Yeah. So, I will start very slowly. So the first thing I want to discuss is functions. Okay. So in general, functions are some sort of map from something to something. Okay. Usually, it is some things are sets. Okay. Often people forget to mention the sets when you talk about function, but I like to talk about functions and something which is in conjunction with the set. Okay, so one of the properties of the functions, mainly the main property, is that if you have two same elements from the set A, then once you apply the function, they have to give you the same exact function, the same exact value. Okay. Actually, it's a kind of characterizing property of functions. So now, simple examples are, for example, you have A equal to B equal to the real line, okay, and F of X, where X is an element of R, gives you a constant value. Okay, for example, C equal to 5. Sub examples, like C equal to 5. You have that for every value X, the function X maps to the value 5. Okay. It's kind of obvious what it is. You know, one of the reasons for which this is important is that certain properties of a function depend on which set you want to define. Right? So let's go right away to some other more complicated examples, slightly more complicated examples. Right? So you have f of x equal to x, and you have something like this. Right? But then you can have also things which are a little bit more complicated. For example, x equal, for x less or equal than 0, you want that the function is equal to 1, and for x positive, you add that the function is equal to -1. So you're going to have something of this other form. Okay. So let me just do it in this way. Yeah. Okay. Now, one of the differences between these types of functions is that some are somehow better than others. Okay. So one of the things is that you know, the first two examples are examples of continuous functions, while the second is an example of discontinuous function. Okay. So now let me go into the details of what continuity is. Okay. So we have continuous functions. Okay. So there is an epsilon delta definition. Okay. So epsilon delta definition. Okay. That I can go through in detail, but maybe later if you want. Okay. So let me go into a visual example. Right. First of all, I have a function again of the form absolute value of x, right? Okay. Which is a continuous function, right? For whenever you choose a equal b equal r, that's a continuous function for every point in R. And the general thing that people say is that you can draw it without removing the pen from the paper. Okay, this definition is not completely, it's not that wonderful, right? Because of the following reason. Suppose that instead of this function here, we have a function of the form of 1 over x, and then you consider domain A equal to 1, 2. Okay. Now, this function here, from 1, 2, is absolutely a continuous function, okay, on the domain 1, 2. Instead, if you try to define f of x or equal to 1 over x with a equal b equal to r, then you run into problems. Now, one of the reasons for which you run into problems is that the division by 0 cannot be well defined, right? At least whatever value you give to x is not going to give you, so if you have x equal to 0, that is not going to give you a real number, right? So this function here is not well defined if you include the domain a equal to b equal to r, right? Now the question is, what is the problem, right? Now the problem is simply the origin. Okay. Because here you can write anyway. Right? Now, is this a continuous or discontinuous function? Well, now, the first thing that you have to think about is where it's well defined, the maximal extensions of which this function is well defined. Right? So this function is well defined where x is different from 0. So the maximal domain in which this function is well defined is minus infinity, 0 excluded, union 0 plus infinity. Now this is something which tricks people, right? But so this function here, f of x equal to 1 over x, let me call this a2, okay, this is a1, b1, is continuous on a2. Okay. So continuity is something which is local, right? So you say that the function is continuous in a set if it's continuous in every point in the set. Now before saying that the function is continuous, it needs to be well defined in that set. Now, in this case, the function is not well defined in that set. It's in particular the origin. Okay. Now, when you have a point in which the function is not well defined or is discontinuous, right? You can ask another question, right? The question is, can I extend f of x equal to 1 over x in x equals 0 such that f of x is continuous. Actually, I should write just f. Is continuous on R. Now the issue with this is that in this particular case you cannot do it. Right? Okay. Whatever extension, right? So on R as a function which goes from R to R. Okay. So whatever value I give to the function in 0, right? The function is going to be discontinuous. Okay. Now, very good. Okay. So, and again, if the domain is connected, the domain in which the definition is connected, you are more or less right about the drawing with the pen. Okay. But if the domain is connected, surely it's not an equivalent condition between continuity and this. Okay. So in general, there is a completed definition. Okay. Suppose I have a function which goes from open set included in a certain domain A, okay, to another subset of R, okay, for example, another set B. Let's think about for now as A and B univariate functions, but it can be multivariate as well. Then you say that, you have epsilon and delta, which are positive constants. So the definition is this, right? So f is continuous at x0 belonging to U if the following condition is satisfied. Okay, for every epsilon there exists delta such that if x is nearby x0, then also f of x is nearby f of x0. Okay. And you can verify that this definition is well defined so it's satisfied in in many of the examples that I gave. But for example, it's not well defined for this function here. Right? Now, if you go through that, let's call f tilde of x to be equal to 1 over x for x different from 0, and c when x is equal to 0. Now, this function is not continuous in 0, okay? Because suppose that you want to put a because in practice, whenever you evaluate, if you check the graph again, let me write this graph again here. Right? No matter what value here it is, you cannot be close enough with the x in such a way that the y are close enough as you want, because the value of the y as it approaches the x equal to 0 goes to infinity. Okay. So this function is not continuous for anything. It's continuous in x equal to 0, no matter the value that you give c to the constant thing. Okay. Very good. Do you have questions on this?
I don't think I fully understood the last bit, so.
This last part, yeah.
Yeah, so is it just that when you have to define, or something, you can have a continuous equation as long as you have your definitions of where it is, like the bounds?
So continuity is a local property. Okay, so you define first that a function is continuous in a certain point, and then you say that the function is continuous on a set if it is continuous in every point of the set. That's in practice how you do it. Okay. Now you want, if I heard right, you want a little bit of more explanation on this writing here.
Yeah, just the second part of why this example of 1 over x, it's discontinuous because you're including when x equals 0.
That's right. So in this particular case, I give a definition of f tilde on every point of the real line.
Okay.
So once it is defined on every point on the real line, I can decide to talk about, I can decide to check its continuity on all its domain definition. Now, in the previous case, when I don't define it in 0, the function is defined only outside 0. And in that case, I can talk about continuity in the points in which it is defined. So there is this thing that continuity, you can talk about that only in domain of definition of the same function, right? And as soon as I add a point here, then the function is going to be discontinuous.
Yeah.
And there is no value c which makes it continuous. But of course, there are situations in which you can add a value to the function, right? Which originally is discontinuous, and you can make it continuous. For example, let me do this example. Very good. My pleasure. So this is our example here, right? it seems tricky, but suppose I define a function this way: x squared over x when x is different from 0, and then I write c when x is equal to 0. Then you are tempted to make a division here, right? X squared over x, right? You're very tempted to divide x squared over x, right? But then you can do it only when x is different from 0. So this division makes sense only when x is different from 0. Otherwise, you cannot do it, right? When x equals 0, you cannot do it. Now, this situation here is, it's kind of I wrote this in this way, just to underline one thing, right? That I cannot define this function here in this way when x is equal to 0. Okay, that I cannot do. But of course, since this function here is, other than in 0, it's exactly the line, right? As soon as I check get c equal to 0, then f tilde f tilde is continuous on all the real line. Okay, very good. So now, once we have continuity, okay, we can talk about something more, namely derivatives. Okay. So now let me go back to one of the examples that I mentioned before. X and Y. Okay. So now this function here, right? It's like you write x for x positive and minus x for x negative. Okay, and then of course you can write include 0 as well, right? In any of the two. Now, one of the things that you see is that the inclination of the line is constant on both sides, but it's different, right? Now, if I draw the graphs of the inclinations, okay, I'm going to have that on the left of 0, I have inclination constant equal to -1. On the right, I have inclination constant equal to +1. Okay. In 0, I don't know, because if I go from this side, it looks like the inclination is -1, and on this side, inclination is +1, right? So here, I don't know what to write here, right? Very good. Now, this point here, at this point here, is a point of not differentiability, okay? Point in which you cannot define the derivative. The derivative is in practice the inclination of a curve in that point. Okay. Now I go to more details. But as you see, you can think of as a point of discontinuity of the inclinations of the curve, of the function defined as the inclination of the curve. Okay. There are specific definitions, right? And in general, when you have a way to compute these derivatives, right? So you identify as f prime or f dot or something like that, is given by this formula. You can write a better, more technical definition as well. Right? You have limit as h goes to 0 of f of x plus h minus f of x divided by h. Okay. So what does this mean? This means this. Suppose you have a curve, okay, of this form. Then you take the value of the function at the point x. Then you take the value of the function at the point x plus h. You take the specific value of the f's, right? So this is going to be f of x plus h, and here we have f of x, right? And then what you do is you take the difference between these two numbers here, and you divide by the inclination of the here. Now, if you think about what this exactly is, right? You connect this distance here, and as soon as you decrease this distance here, h, right? This inclination here, so this line here goes closer and closer to being the tangent line of the curve. Okay, very good. So let's do some examples of derivative using this definition. Okay, so suppose that f of x is equal to the function x. Then you have that, of course, you know, now let me go through some detailed examples here, and then I will show another one. So then, if you compute f of x plus h, you have x plus h. So if you want to compute the derivative, limit as h goes to 0 of, well, x plus h minus x divided by h. And this gives you exactly 1, as expected. Okay. Now let me go instead to the other case. Now note that in this definition it's kind of implicit that h can go from right to left, right? We don't ask h to be positive or negative. Okay. Now let's check this other example here. Now if I try to do the same computation I did before, well, I run into a little bit of problems, right? Because you know, it's not the absolute value of x plus h minus absolute value of x is absolute value of h. You just can't do that, right? It depends on some other things, right? The sign and so on, right? And even if that is the case, then you would have absolute value of h divided by h. Okay. So so how do you do this? Okay. Well, the first thing to say is that if x is positive, right? Then when h is small enough, then x plus h is also positive, right? Because if x is 0.01 and h is going smaller and smaller, then 0.01 plus 1 over 1 trillion, then it's going to be still positive, minus 1 over 1 trillion is going to be still positive, right? No matter what the sign of h. So if x is positive, then this limit star, right, is going to be equal to, well, limit when h goes to 0 of x plus h minus x divided by h. And this gives you 1. Of course, if x is negative, same argument applies, right? And so if x is negative, x plus h is negative. So the absolute value of x plus h is minus x plus h. The absolute values of of x is minus x divided by h, and this gives you minus 1. Okay? So when x is positive, when x is negative, no problem in computing this limit. Okay? Okay, the only problem, if there is, and I will show that there is when you are in 0. Okay? So now when x is equal to 0, then you have that the limit when h goes to 0 of absolute value of x plus h minus absolute value of x divided by h is equal to the limit when h goes to 0, okay, of absolute value of h divided by h. Now the point is that this value here is going to be plus 1 when h is positive and minus 1 when h is negative. So it's not well defined, right? Because if a limit exists, it needs to be unique. Problem? But if lim exists, is unique. So absolute value of x does not have a derivative in 0. Okay. Very good. So then one can keep going, right? We can do higher order derivatives. Okay. and it's already dead. You have to change column. And those are in general derivatives of derivative. Okay. So you have a second derivative, for example. You have a third derivative, and so on. Okay. So each have other interpretations. So the second derivative is related to concavity, and so on. So now let me see what differential equations are. Okay. So those are relationships between a function and its derivatives. Okay. The most general case, now we're talking about only ordinary differential equations, namely equations in which the independent variable is one-dimensional. Okay, one-dimensional. Okay, they take a form. They take this form, f of x, big F, let me call it like that, small f of x, f prime of x, and so on, f, let's say, k of x equals 0. Okay, so it's a relationship between the functions, right? Between the independent variable, the function, and its derivative. Okay. Now, there's no lot of generality to write it here 0 because you can translate f accordingly. Right? So if you have f equal to something, you translate with respect to the value here, with f tilde, and then you have a similar relationship. Right? So let's consider a simple case. When f of what is argument here is defined as f prime of x. Okay. In practice, it's a function which spits out its third argument. Okay, this function big F. Well, then you have f prime of x equals 0. What this means that you're looking for functions whose inclination is always constant. Sorry, whose inclination is always 0. So, constant function. Okay. Now, other examples are a little bit more complicated. Okay. So suppose that instead my big F doesn't spit out only f prime, but is defined as f prime of x minus, let's say, another constant b times f of x. Okay, so here you have to define, you have to solve then something of this form. So you have a function whose derivative is a multiple of the function. Now, I already know the solution of figure, right? But there are certain things that one can already be careful about. Okay. So let me go directly to the next page, and I will solve this one. So how to find all f prime of x, or all f of x, such that f prime of x is equal to b f of x. Okay? Thank you. So let me rewrite this f prime of x in a different way. So you take another way to do it is using this notation here, right? So this is equal to f prime, okay, of x equal to df over dx. Okay, that's another notation which wants to express the fact that you want to compare the variation of f with respect to the variation in x at the point x. The infinitesimal variation of f with respect to the infinitesimal variation in x at the point x. Now, formally, one would say, well, here it looks like there is a parameter, there are a couple of variables, f and x, one is independent, the other is dependent. And so one thinks about, maybe I bring all the variable on one side and all the variable with all the variable s on one side and all the variable x on the other side. Let me do another thing first. Now, the first thing is you can divide again only if f value is different from 0, right? Division by 0 is not allowed. Now, so if f is equal to 0, then f is a solution. So f equal to 0 is a solution because if f is equal to 0, its derivative is 0, right? So good. So now let's assume f different from 0. Okay? So if f is different from 0, you're going to have f prime over f equal to constant. Okay. Now, of course, again, now you might have different value of the constant, right? Now, suppose that b is equal to 0, right? Just an example, but it comes out also from the computation. Now, if b is equal to 0, then you have that f prime over f must be equal to 0. And so f prime is equal to 0. And so you have that f is equal to constant. Yeah. So very good. Now here, I should have another example before, but let me do it now. Let me do an example of derivative, another example of derivative. Suppose that I have f of x, which is equal to logarithm of x. Okay. Now all of these is defined only when x is positive. Okay. Logarithm is defined only when x is positive. Okay. Now, if you try to define the derivative of this with the computation that you've done the other time, you're going to get that the other time, a few minutes ago, you're going to get that this is equal to 1 over x. Right. Now, let me do a more complicated example. Right. Now, suppose that this the function actually that I'm trying to take the derivative is not a logarithm of x, but it's a logarithm of another function of x. Now, if you do the same procedure, we can also discuss this another time, and you take the derivative of this, what you're going to get is that you get that this is equal to g prime over g of x. Okay. You can show this as the general theorem, right? It's called chain rule. Now, if you apply this situation here, right, this left-hand side is basically the derivative of the logarithm of f of x. Now, if a derivative of something is a constant, right? That something must be a linear function, linear times a constant. So you're gonna have, it comes with some similar procedure. If you remember if you want to find f, you have to take some sort of inverse function of the logarithm, right? That we know it's exponential. So here we have f of x equal to the exponential of bx plus a. And so this solves the original differential equation, right? In the sense that if you plug this inside, right, then you get that it satisfies this condition, the original condition. Okay. Now there are more complicated differential equations, of course. Now the second example that we discuss and probably discuss. So now since we find okay, very good. So we'll discuss some more examples next time, right? In particular, we're going to discuss next time, okay, linear differential equations. In brief, and then maybe we'll go on with this specific example from the group. The order of a differential equation. And then some example. And we'll concentrate for now on these. Most of the questions in chapter 5 are all these. And I will explain what these things are in the next lecture. So I think I have annoyed you enough for today with this stuff. Okay. So do you have questions or comments?